Now I can get going.
There you go.
All right, now you see what you should be seeing, correct?
Yep, you're good.
All right. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Today, I am Adam Austin, Extension Educator in Wright County for Agriculture and Horticulture. I'll just be going over some of the real basics of the nutrients in your garden. But before I get into that, just a few housekeeping notes about today's webinar. Of course, you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you today. So because of that, we are asking that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Our other panelists will be working in the background to get these answered, and we'll also take some time to answer some of them live. So you can like people's questions using that Q&A also to make them a higher priority for us. Let us know that you have the same or a similar question. And you can still use the chat feature as well for comments, or if you're having any sort of technical issues that we might be able to help you out with. Also, Katie and the rest of you, just because I can't necessarily see the Zoom thing right now, I'm looking at my presentation. Let me know if I need to stop and address anything. And I think that's about all I need to say before we get going. This is being recorded and will be sent to you to look back on in the near future here later this week or early next week. So getting right into it, what I'm going to cover today is just kind of an overview of some of the more common nutrients in your garden. So as you see on there, we have nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are kind of the main three that'll take up the bulk of our time. And then we'll get into some secondary nutrients, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and just very briefly touch on some micronutrients. And then also for a little bit, just talk about some factors that affect nutrient uptake and what that might look like in your garden. So hopping right into nitrogen, or N if you just want to take the elemental symbol. This could probably be argued depending on where you lie with nutrients and what your garden looks like. But for the most part, nitrogen is considered the most important nutrient. And that's because there are large quantities of it in plants, and it's very important, especially for vegetative growth and energy in the plant. It's also the most dynamic plant nutrient, which is a big part of the reason why I will be talking about this one the most today. And by dynamic, what I mean is this, the nitrogen cycle. So I'm not going to make you learn the whole nitrogen cycle today, but basically some main inputs from this is in the blue, you can see all the ways that nitrogen can be added to our soil, whether it's through just coming from the atmosphere of manure, plant residue from previous years, and also different biological processes. The green bubbles are different forms of nitrogen that can occur. Atmospheric nitrogen takes up about 78% of our air in the atmosphere. And then in the soil, we have organic nitrogen. And all that means for today, organic means it has carbon attached to it. So this isn't an organic versus inorganic as far as farming practices. What it means in this case is it just has carbon attached to it and cannot be taken up by plants. What needs to happen, let me go back. What needs to happen is it needs to turn into one of these ammonium or nitrate forms for it to be available to the plant, and that can change and go back to organic nitrogen, and it can be lost through leaching down deep into our soil profile and some other processes, including runoff and erosion. So now moving on, this is just another look at the nitrogen cycle, more of a linear way to look at it, since that maybe works better in some of your brains. Once again, not important that you fully understand the N cycle, but maybe take home some of these main points that, first of all, organic N is unavailable to the plants, and natural processes by plants and microorganisms make the nitrogen available in inorganic forms as ammonia and nitrate. Available nitrogen can also be lost through immobilization, leaching it into the air. And so because of all of this, nitrogen is very dynamic, and the amount of N available to plants can vary greatly in short amount of time. Just another few last points on nitrogen. As I mentioned, usable only in those inorganic forms of nitrate and ammonium. It's always a need in gardens, and it's very mobile in the plants, meaning that if the new growth of the plant needs some nitrogen, it is free to take that from the older parts of the plant and very easily move it to where it needs to be, which isn't the case for all nutrients. And lastly, just to note that it can be a concern for water quality. Nitrates in the water have some negative effects, so we just want to make sure we're applying these responsibly and mindfully when we're doing those sort of things. So lastly, on nitrogen, just identifying a potential nitrogen deficiency, yellowing. Just think of that if you have plants turning yellow and they're not in a drought situation or some other factors can be thrown out the window, you might have a nitrogen deficiency. So usually starting at the old part of the plant or the bottom of the plant, you will see yellowing along the veins of the leaves. Kind of starts at the veins and spreads out. In the top picture here, you can kind of see the mid vein of the corn leaf, and it's spreading away from that main vein. If this tomato plant was in the earlier stages of its symptomology, you would see the chlorosis, which is just a fancy word for yellowing. You would see that starting along the veins and spreading out from there. So those are the telltale signs of a possible nitrogen deficiency in your soil. Next, we're going to talk about phosphorus. So when you think about phosphorus, think about it as feeding the roots. That is maybe its most important role, but as all of these nutrients do, phosphorus has a lot of roles in the plant. But when you think of phosphorus, once again, think of it as what feeds the roots, and that's where it's needed most heavily. Phosphorus is a problem in soil fertility for three main reasons. First, total phosphorus levels in the soil are fairly low, so we're starting off kind of behind the eight ball just a little bit there. Secondly, most phosphorus in the soil is in forms that are unavailable for plant uptake. Think kind of back similarly to that inorganic versus organic nitrogen. Phosphorus doesn't behave exactly the same way, but it's kind of the same sort of thing where it might be there in the soil, but because of how it's sitting there in the soil, isn't readily available for plant uptake. And then lastly, when soluble forms or the forms that can be taken up by plants are added to the soil, they can quickly become insoluble and turn into those forms that are not available to our plants. So just keep that in mind when you're putting phosphorus fertilizers on your gardens. Just a little bit more on phosphorus, getting into the deficiency symptoms of this one. This one, you're not going to see yellow, you're going to see purple, especially in the leaf veins. This picture doesn't really show that very, very well because it's not starting in the leaf veins. In this case, it's kind of working opposite. So there is no hard guidelines to follow, but purpling is going to be kind of your giveaway there. And then also one last note, that phosphorus skin is also a huge water quality concern. So be careful not to over apply. Don't apply before heavy rainfall events that could cause it to be lost to runoff or any erosion, as well as leaching. And also just if you're near a river, lake, stream, take a little bit of extra caution to make sure we're not losing that fertilizer into our water sources. Now on to potassium, which elemental letter is K. Potassium is a nutrient that doesn't really act like nitrogen or phosphorus. It isn't lost to the atmosphere like N, and doesn't constantly change forms back and forth like nitrogen can either. And it doesn't really behave like phosphorus either. Its behavior is mostly influenced by soil type, and also it isn't an environmental concern when it moves off-site. Potassium is especially important in helping plants adapt to the environment, however. It really improves that plant resiliency. It helps improve drought tolerance to cold temperatures, as well as your overwinter hardiness, and also helps defend against pests like disease and fungi. So these are your main three right here, N, P, and K, that you're going to be most concerned about in your garden. Potassium, like nitrogen, the main symptom is going to be yellowing, except it's going to be kind of opposite from nitrogen, where the nitrogen starts to start in the inside of the leaf near those veins. You're going to see kind of the opposite, where you get that nice yellow ring right around the outside of the leaf and moving inside, as you can see on that cucumber. So just to kind of wrap things up on our top three nutrients of today, N, P, and K, nitrogen is always changing in the soil and is an inevitable part of a plant's energy system. That's going to be your number one concern every year, is making sure you have your nitrate rates right in your soil. End deficiency symptoms, of course, is the yellowing of older leaves starting at the leaf veins and spreading to the rest of the leaf. Phosphorus feeds the roots of your plant, and its main deficiency symptom is turning purple. And potassium feeds the flowers and fruits of your plants. And deficient plants usually start turning yellow from the outside of the leaf, working its way. So that's your big three for today. And I know I'm spitting a lot of information at you right now because I'm trying to get through this quickly to save time for the rest of our presentation today. So feel free to use that Q&A to ask some questions that we'll address when I am done. Now on to some secondary nutrients, also known as, these are also macronutrients, but they are kind of considered secondary to our N, P, and K that I've already addressed. So calcium is important, especially in young plants. Many people talk about the importance of calcium for tomatoes as well. Calcium is immobile in the plant. So unlike nitrogen, this means that if a plant needs more calcium in the new growth, it can't just steal some from the older parts of the plant and move it to where it needs it now. It's going to need to find new calcium in the soil around its roots that it can move into the new growth. Sulfur is, it's actually needed in fairly small amounts relative to our other macronutrients. Sulfur deficiencies used to never be a concern at all, thanks to our acid rain events that we'd have. But because these acid rain events aren't as common, it's becoming a little bit more of a concern. When you think of sulfur, think of it as acting similarly to nitrogen in that it needs to be in inorganic forms to be consumable by plants and also can vary quite a bit in the soil. But unlike nitrogen, in that it is very immobile in the plant. So just like calcium, you're going to need to keep finding new sulfur to add to your plants throughout the season. Let's see. Oh, also, the sulfur is especially important for plants in the legume, cabbage, and onion families. So if you're growing anything in those families, keep that in mind, as it may be giving you a little bit more of an issue than it might in other plant families. The last secondary nutrient that I'm going to talk about is magnesium. Magnesium is essential for energy for many different reasons. It has many different roles in the plant, as these all do. But it is also necessary for a ton of things in the plant, such as forming sugars, fats, and oils. And it also plays an important role in moving phosphorus around the plant. So it's pretty common that you think you might be having a phosphorus deficiency, but if you might actually just be low on magnesium, and your plant's ability to move that phosphorus around the plant is being inhibited by a lack of magnesium. So just very briefly there on a few secondary nutrients. And then getting into some micronutrients. So I'm really going to just briefly cover these since for the most part, you're not going to see issues with these in your garden. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the details on micronutrients, but just be aware that all of these are playing important roles in your gardens and in your plants. Also known as trace minerals or nutrients, all of these have specific roles in plants, whether that be being components of enzymes. Some help create energy or have roles in photosynthesis, and some help maintain balance within the plant and help fight environmental stressors, similar to potassium. So they all have their own little roles, and all of these nutrients, macro and micro, are working together to have healthy plants. Most gardens will have these micronutrients in sufficient quantities, but just keep these in the back of your mind if you're having issues in your garden and you just can't figure out what else it might be. It's not a macronutrient deficiency. It's not a disease. It's not some other sort of pest. Then it's possible, especially with certain finicky plants, that you might be lacking a micronutrient in your soil. Then just lastly, the last part of my presentation, some other factors that affect nutrient availability. So kind of think back to nitrogen because it's kind of the most fickle in our soil. For me, it's easiest to imagine nitrogen when it comes to these other factors. There are a lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to plant nutrition beyond just the nutrient being present and in the root zone. Remember, it needs to be in available forms, like I mentioned with nitrogen, but also things like soil texture, because soils with a lot of clay hold on to nutrients a lot better than sandy soils. This is thanks to something we call cation exchange capacity. Now, you don't need to know what that means for today, but basically, clay soils are good at holding on to water and nutrients. Sandy soils are not. Water also moves through sandy profiles much faster, so more nutrients can be lost to leaching that deep down into the soil beyond where the roots can reach. Also, just a quick note on soil texture. I believe Bob plans on getting into this a little bit more in depth later today, but if you're using potting mixes, be careful. Not saying that potting mixes are bad, but they're kind of wild cards, and you kind of need to play each potting mix separately because it may be lacking greatly in certain nutrients. So on to the next point there, which is organic matter. If you were here yesterday, you remember Robin talking about organic matter in the soil and how we like to see that number be above at least 3%. That's because organic matter, which is just old decaying plant matter, acts like a sponge for nitrogen and other nutrients and keeps those nutrients from being lost, keeps them up towards the top of your soil profile. Organic matter is a huge indicator of soil health. Also, weather conditions play a role in nutrients availability to plants, as this varies as temperature changes. Specifically, cold temperatures and even more specifically cold soil temps can lead to a lot of nutrients kind of being bound to the soil and unavailable for plant uptake. Precipitation, of course, is another factor. Heavy rain that can lead to the loss of nutrients, once again due to leaching, and also runoff and erosion over the soil surface. But a lack of water in the soil can also inhibit a nutrient's ability to be incorporated into the soil or its ability to be taken up into the plant. So if we're sitting in a lot of wet soil like we were last spring, or things are kind of dry like they might be for you this spring, that could be an issue for nutrient uptake as well. One more here is just biological factors, especially with nitrogen. Think about the microorganisms and the microbes that take organic nitrogen and transform it into inorganic forms. There's also plants that are legumes like beans and peas that can, quote unquote, fix nitrogen in the soil through special processes and make it available. So there's a lot going on in the soil that you don't necessarily need to be an expert on, but it's good to know that that is having an effect on the nutrition of your plant. And then lastly, pH. This is the last part of my presentation here, but just a quick reminder from Katie and Robin's presentation, if you were with us yesterday. The pH of your soil is a huge consideration when it comes to the fertility of your garden. The ideal range for soil pH is probably about 6.1 to 6.9, but soils with pHs slightly outside that range can be worked with. It's just that certain adjustments may need to be made to the amounts of fertilizer that you're applying. But with soils that have more extreme pHs in either direction, your soil may need some attention to get it functioning properly. I won't get too into that today. This is kind of building again off of Robin's presentation yesterday. But if you're trying to lower the pH of your soil, there's peat and fertilizer containing ammonium or sulfur that can help you out with that. And if you have an acidic soil that needs to be raised, there's lime. So playing with pH is tricky, so don't expect to magically fix this permanently. But it is something that you can kind of deal with on a short-term basis. So that is all I have. Hopefully you're using that Q&A box to get your questions in. And that was just a lot of information to kind of introduce to you how nutrients behave in your soil and how those nutrients are in fertilizers and how that all interacts together. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and maybe we can pause and take a moment to address some of these questions.
We did just have a note from our friendly soil scientist that several people are concerned about purple leaves on tomatoes, and some of that may be due to cold shock at night, especially here recently. We've had a lot of cold nights, and that can kind of temporarily turn things purple. So making sure that it's not a weather issue before going out and buying a lot of phosphorus or potassium to deal with that. So just wanted to make that quick clarification. I know, Adam, you addressed the temperature a little bit, but just wanted to make sure we got that out there.
And that's probably a good thing to address quickly is that there's always other things that it could be. Just because you have intervenal chlorosis, which is the fancy science term for a nitrogen deficiency and yellowing in the veins, there are other things it could potentially be. So it's none of these are for sure indicators of deficiencies, but it's definitely a good start. Also, I know with potassium around the edge of the leaves, you can also get some insects that kind of do similar sort of feeding habits. So a lot of things to take into consideration, but just something to kind of keep your eye out for.
Absolutely. I think a lot of these other questions are going to get answered as we kind of go throughout here. So for now, Adam, if you want to pass over.
Yeah. Troy, I think you're up.
Very good. I'll begin by sharing my screen here. Is that okay, Katie?
Yep, you are looking great. We're good to go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Katie and Adam. You did a great job, Adam, setting up for the next portion of this presentation. My topic today is talking about the aspects of inorganic nutrient management in relationship to soils. In my case, my name is Troy Sulzer, and I work for the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Louis County. When I think about the aspects of plant growth, I always think about a barrel in relationship to the nutrients that are there. In most cases, as we think about gardens, generally speaking, our most limiting nutrient is nitrogen, as Adam suggested. Sometimes the next would be pH, potassium, phosphorus, and then other micronutrients. I think about this barrel as we go through the process of adding these specific nutrients, it is as if you're plugging the barrel, and if you're running water in the top, you continue to allow that barrel to fill to get higher and higher production from your garden. Once again, reiterating the importance of a soil test to correct your issues is the most important. And some of our inorganic sources would include, for nitrogen specifically, would include urea, 4600, which means that it is 46% nitrogen. Ammonium sulfate, 2100, which is 21% nitrogen, and ammonium nitrate, typically about 34%. Our potassium sources would be muriate of potash, 0060, potassium sulfate, 0040, and wood ash. Many people think about wood ash as a good source of potassium, and it is, but it is very important that you evaluate your soil test, because wood ash also contains magnesium and calcium, which increase soil pH, and especially if you are in alkaline soils or soils where your pH is already kind of at that high level, 6.8, 6.9. We want to be very, very careful not to apply wood ash or over apply wood ash as a source of potassium. And so I caution you in relationship to that. For phosphorus, we have ammonium phosphorus, DAP, 18460, and monoammonium phosphate, which is MAP, 11520. We had several questions in relationship to the aspects of phosphorus and phosphorus deficiencies with the purpling leaves. I too would caution you, it's important to go ahead and fix your major problems with these potentially inorganic sources. But if you're going to try to address some of those purpling issues, you'd be better off to utilize maybe a water-soluble phosphorus, which would require much less phosphorus addition just by adding that to your water, mixing that up real well, and just putting it on that direct plant, not over all of your entire garden. In that case, you're adding much less phosphorus and kind of addressing that. You can also use foliar feeding in that particular case, which is a lot more complicated and far beyond the scope of this particular presentation. So as we look at fertilizer labels, we go to our home centers and such, and we will look at a bag such as this one here, 2015, 2510. And what that describes is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that particular product. So in this case, it would represent 15% nitrogen, 25% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. I like to try and boil these things down simple enough that my brain can understand them. And so in that particular case, I look at a product such as this bag, and I would consider this what is called a complete fertilizer. It contains N, P, and K in relationship to that. And one of the most common is 10-10-10 out there. In order to make the complete fertilizer, we use single nutrient fertilizers, such as the ones I described before, urea, for example, 4600, which is the product that is utilized primarily for blending into a complete fertilizer like this, with additions of phosphorus and potassium to make the complete fertilizer. When we think about grades of fertilizer, it refers to the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium. So in the case of a 15, 25, 10, they're all divisible by 5, so it would be a ratio of 3 to 5 to 2. So we talked yesterday about how to calculate those rates, and there was a lot of questions that revolved around that. And so I think that I'd like to try and help clarify some of those questions in relationship to that. So as an example, we get a soil test report, and that soil test report comes back with phosphorus at 80, which is in the very high category, potassium at 120, which would be medium high, and the recommendation on the soil test suggests 0.2 pounds per 100 square feet of nitrogen, 0 phosphorus, and 0.2 pounds of potassium to achieve the sort of yield goal that we expect from a typical garden. So in this process, it requires a couple of steps. First, you have to go out and find a blend from your garden center so that we can add the nutrients to it. We want to be sure to avoid adding excess phosphorus, make sure there's plenty of nitrogen at an adequate level, not excessive. And when we think about these things, it is better to maybe over apply the potassium and or phosphorus to a slight degree, as those are much more stable and attach quite tightly to the soil particles there and can be utilized for further use into the future, if not utilize that first year. And then we need to calculate the required amount of that fertilizer to be added. So in this particular case, this is an example, and I know that many of you get frustrated when you go to home and garden centers. They never have the ratio that the soil test suggests, but they have some that are iterations of that. And so what I do is I boil it down in relationship to the ratio of the nitrogen to the phosphorus to the potassium. And as you look through these examples, we see, for example, that 2733 would be a 9 to 1 to 1 versus the 12 12 12 would be a 1 to 1 to 1, and so on down this list. So as we look through this, we don't find that any of them are the exact 1 to 0 to 1 like we were looking at our soil test, but the one that is the closest basically is the 25 3 12 in relationship to this. And so it would apply a very small amount of extra phosphorus, but only a small amount in that particular case. So if we have a 300 square foot garden as described yesterday in the example of calculation, and we needed to apply that 0.2 pounds of nitrogen, 0 phosphorus, and 0.2 potassium, we need to select the blend that is closest to that ratio as suggested earlier. And in that case, we would want to take that 0.2 divided by 0.25 because our blend is 25% nitrogen, which gives us a total of 0.8 pounds of the 25 3 12 to supply the 0.2 pounds of nitrogen required. And if we have a 300 square foot garden, we take that times 3, and that comes to 2.4 pounds of this mixture for that 300 square foot garden. And down on the bottom there, you can see the fertilizer rule of thumb. Generally speaking, a cup of fertilizer equals about a ½ pound total, and you can kind of use that as a rule of thumb as you think about this. With that, I will stop my screen share and turn that over to Bob at this point.
Thank you, Troy. Katie, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. If you want to go ahead and turn your video on, Bob, and then
Okay.
on the bottom of the screen, you should be able to share screen and then share your PowerPoint.
Okay, the message I'm getting is my host has prohibited me from turning on the video.
All right, now try.
Okay, hey, that's
There you
better.
go.
Hello, everybody. We'll get. Okay.
There we go.
Are you getting
I
the PowerPoint?
am, yep, just get into presenting.
Are
So
we good?
you need to click on slideshow there.
Are we ready to start? Okay.
Yep,
Real fine.
there you go.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Robert Olin. Work with the Extension Service of St. Louis County. And I appreciate being able to spend a little time with you today. I appreciate my colleagues, both Adam and Troy, and their discussion. And I'm sure we're going to have opportunities for questions if any of these things aren't particularly clear. You know, the use of fertility, both in an agricultural sense as well as in a gardening sense, is extremely significant. As a matter of fact, I was struck by the fact that the world's population was sustainable for a long, long time at about 500 million. And then it was just after the Second World War that suddenly we realized how to produce more food. And with that, we had a tremendous increase in the world's population, continues to this day. And one of the most significant parts of that has really been the understanding of the importance of fertility, and in particular, the ability to fix nitrogen, take it out of the air, and make it in forms that are available for plants. So I think that all gardeners really want to pay particularly attention to good sources of fertility. You've taken a soil test, you know where there may be some deficiencies, and then you've got a number of choices. Troy did a nice job of going over some of the inorganic options that we have, and I'm going to take a little look at some of the organic options. A lot of gardeners certainly are interested in doing things as naturally as possible. That's one of the real nice advantages of being able to garden and control your inputs and your food supply. Let me give you just a little bit of some of the definitions that I think we should get out of the way. The chemical definition of organic is any compound that contains carbon. So this can be a natural compound, it could be a synthetic compound. And where we got into a little difficulty, the discussion with a lot of pesticides were synthesized organic compounds in a chemical sense. So when it came to the point of determining just what is organic production, the U.S. Department of Agriculture went about coming up with a definition of certified organic production. So in a general sense, certified production means your inputs, which would include pesticides and other inputs, come off a list of materials that were actually put together over time, and they can include both organic compounds in the chemical sense, as well as some inorganic compounds that are naturally sourced. So we really have got these 2 points to consider. What is organic? If it's certified organic, then it really can only utilize those inputs that are permitted on the organic list. So that would eliminate a lot of these synthetic bagged fertilizers that you might want to utilize. Another quick point, Department of Ag, again, under their term of certified organic, this really only applies to the production of food and fiber. So I'll oftentimes get the question from people about lawn care and landscape. They can use their terminology as they see fit, and we really don't have that same kind of an organic certification process involved with these particular industries. So you've got some choices as gardeners, which is the wonderful thing, either organic or inorganic fertilizers. I want to take a look at both of them. In the case for inorganics, which these again are the bagged synthetic fertilizers, which Troy spent a good time explaining there. One of the real nice things is they tend to be very water soluble. We've got to get fertility into solution so that the plant can pick it up, and availability, and Troy referenced this as well, must be available to the plant at the time when it needs it. So that's desirable, but they can also be very concentrated, and there's potential for some high burning as a possibility. There's also the possibility of either leaching or runoff. They're very soluble, so once again, we don't want to lose it through the root zone. We also certainly don't want to run it off into any watershed or body of water of any type. Another nice aspect of the inorganics is they're very, very uniform. They're very consistent. You've got a certification process there where you can rely on exactly and know exactly what the chemical composition of those bags are. So it makes it very easy to calculate. And in the last couple of examples, we can determine exactly how to apply, say, 1 pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. We can determine that very readily with a commercial fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer. The concentrations, once again, can be very concentrated. This can be good or bad. If properly applied, it can be excellent. You don't have to move that much material around. If improperly applied, you can over apply quite readily. Another advantage is they have a relatively low cost overall. Now, when you take a look at organic fertilizers, once again, we've got lower nutrient concentrations here, and we've got variable composition. And oftentimes the organic fertilizer depends on the source. And we'll talk about any number of sources wherever they originated. This determines pretty much the nature of the composition. And then often they're going to come at a higher cost based on the amount of available nutrients. Another aspect of organics is that the nutrient release tends to be very slow, and in many cases too slow, as I've highlighted here in the case of nitrogen, where you may see a nutrient deficiency, as Adam pointed out earlier, and you obviously don't have 2 or 3 months if you're in the middle of your growing season to get that nutrient in a form that's available to the plant. So sometimes organic sources, because they're slow to release, may not be the easiest or the best choice. Then it can be quite difficult to calculate the rates. Troy went through a nice example there of how you can apply a certain amount of nitrogen for 300 square foot garden. A little harder to tell that with manures or with meals or with other organic materials because we're not really certain about the consistency of the product. And then one of the disadvantages of organics, and we thought these things would be perfect, but obviously nothing in this world is perfect, but they can contain weed seed. And any of you that have had experience with cattle manures and so forth know that these animals pass a lot of these weeds. They're very resistant, pass right through the digestive tract. They're part of the manure. So that can certainly be a downside. And then we're aware of the potential for pathogens as well, which you wouldn't have with an inorganic. With organics, particularly some types of organic manures, we have to be very, very conscious of it. We're well aware of some of the difficulties that we had with romaine lettuce on a couple of occasions, and one of the real ironies is some of the pathogens came from organic sources or organics that got into a water supply. So we have to be conscious of that, and we have to be careful of that. Once again, just by basis of emphasis here, you want to make this distinction between a product that's chemically organic, contains carbon, versus those which are approved for use for organic production, which are those compounds which are on a list supplied by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Once again, I want to take a quick look at the way the plant utilizes organics versus inorganics. Now, one of the real interesting aspects, plants pick up fertility in the inorganic form. So these are much smaller molecules, and in many cases, organic materials start out as very complex compounds, which are very large, and they have to be reduced into simpler and inorganic forms for the plant to use. So basically, whatever the source is, whether it's a synthetic fertilizer, an inorganic, or whether it's an organic fertilizer, originally, it all has to be reduced into a simple form, and that's the inorganic form, small molecules, so the plant can pass through the membrane and pick that up into the root system. So organic nutrient sources, these are generally always derived from living organisms, typically plants and animals. And our principal sources of organic nutrients are going to be manures, compost, and then plant and animal meals. When we talk about compost, composting is really a process. It's a process where we're taking, once again, complex organic materials and then reducing them down and kind of digesting them into simpler forms. So you can compost manures, you can compost basically any type of plant or animal material can really be composted. I want to take a quick little look at, these are the inorganic phosphorus and potassium sources that are approved for use with certified organic production. So once again, even though this is certified organic, these are not really organic materials that are being used as fertilizers, but they are naturally sourced and they're not processed. And these are the big three. There are some others out there that are approved in some form or another, but people may be familiar with these. They're readily available. Granite meal, and that's just going to be potassium. And once again, when I talk about availability, very slow. And you can imagine that's just ground up granite, basically. And then a very interesting compound called green sand. Much of that, most of it, to my knowledge at least, is being mined out in New Jersey, where they have a major on-land deposit. There are some subterranean deposits out in the ocean, difficult to get to. But green sand is a very interesting compound because it contains both phosphorus as well as potassium and a number of trace elements as well. But once again, the availability is very slow as we break this down and make it into a form that's soluble and available to the plants. And then for phosphorus, a very good source and high concentrated source is rock phosphorus. But once again, up to 30% approximately of available phosphorus or phosphorus. And once again, in terms of availability, it's going to take quite a while for that to get into a form that's soluble that the plant can pick up and use. Nutrient content of our animal manures. And we've got a lot of different choices here, and this can be variable again. And this is a percentage of dry weight. And let's just take a look at beef manure as an example, 1.2% nitrogen, 2% phosphorus, 2% potassium. Once again, you'll note how these levels are significantly lower than the concentrated inorganic forms that can be purchased. Just take as an example a bag of 10-10-10 or 777 fertilizer. So on a percent dry weight basis, they are considerably lower in terms of nutrient content. Once again, just as an example, both sheep and swine manures and the availability, but in every case, even though this can be variable, and it does depend obviously on what these animals have been eating. I did get the question, how do they produce these? They really don't produce them. The plants that they're consuming produce these or contain them, and these are just passed through, and this is what the animal itself doesn't pick up, and it just eliminates. So you're getting some of the benefit that originally came from the plant material that these animals were consuming. Let's take a look at some of the meals. And these, I think, can be very good sources of nutrient. The alfalfa, obviously there, it's a little more balanced. Blood meals, and once again, these are products that are processed and be purchased. And you'll notice the very high nitrogen content. In some cases, available nitrogen can be a real challenge for organic materials. So blood meal is certainly something that you want to consider. Bone meal, both raw and processed, you want to be a little aware of the difference there. As it's steamed, we do reduce the potassium levels. So we've got products here where we can get N, P, and K in organic sources, from organic sources. And again, some of the other meals, castor bean, and you can take a look at some of the numbers, cottonseal, seed meal. The fish meals, of course, are very high in nitrogen. And some of the other plant materials, kelp seaweed, peanut meal, soybean meal. So once again, the protein content that's available in both peanut meals and soybean meals is expressed here as a high nitrogen content. Now, when we take a look at compost, or what we typically think of as compost, you'll note again that the N, P, and K levels are significantly lower. Yard waste, which most of you, if you're running a compost pile, you're probably going to be producing or using a lot of yard waste as a feedstock. And again, the nutrient content can depend on what you're using in your compost pile. Crop residues, obviously, things you'll pull off the garden, and then vermicompost, where if you're actually using worms to compost kitchen waste, you'll note again, in particular, that we've got just a little bit higher nitrogen component of a vermicompost as opposed to a yard waste compost, as an example. I should be aware again that in the nitrogen composition, and nitrogen, as Troy indicated, and Adam, is a significant item, a significant fertility component, and it must be available in inorganic or a soluble form. You'll notice in the case of compost that our organic nitrogen, the organic component tied into carbon, is over 90%. The inorganic, which is the form that the plant ultimately can use, is going to be less than 10%. So once again, availability becomes a significant issue. Now, in many cases, what will occur, people will utilize a lot of compost, and we're going to need additional nitrogen. Eventually, we will probably meet the needs of our phosphorus and potassium because they adhere very tightly to the soil. So we get in a situation where we really want to find composts that are a little bit higher in nitrogen as a component. And I just highlighted here, we went back to the carbon nitrogen ratios, the amount of carbon compared to the amount of nitrogen. Once again, the lower the ratio of carbon, the higher the nitrogen component. So if you're really in a situation where you're looking for a higher nitrogen compost, then you want to start by actually composting higher nitrogen materials. And here I highlighted some: coffee grounds, manures in general, animal manures, fruit waste, green grass clippings. As soon as green material becomes brown material, it loses its nitrogen. That's because the chlorophyll molecule is a magnesium surrounded by 4 nitrogen atoms, and it can be very unstable. Vegetable trimmings, once again, the carbon nitrogen ratio is quite low there, so you're getting quite a bit of nitrogen. I made this distinction here when we take a look at oak leaves that are green. I've got in the other pile there, or the other column there, leaves which are dried, a 60 to 1, lots of carbon there in the dried material. In a green leaf or green grass, you again have got much more nitrogen available. I mentioned manures, and then you'll note table scraps. Table scraps probably have more nitrogen than any of these other components combined, and that's because we do throw out, and in our table scraps, some high protein meat products. So once again, and I've actually done this myself, where I want a high nitrogen compost, you can actually take some of these ideas and run 2 piles. So you got a high nitrogen compost product as a result, because you're using feedstocks that are higher in nitrogen, and you've got another pile where you're using all of your brown leaves and other materials, crop residue and so forth, that is going to be lower in nitrogen unless you make a point of actually adding nitrogen from some source in the compost process. We decided as a group that there's so many people are taking a look at container gardening. It's a little bit unique. And so we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about fertility there. In most cases, you're going to be using some kind of a packaged mix. These are virtually all peat-based mixes, and most peats in your soil mix, as opposed to a garden soil as such, most of these really are quite acidic and nutrient deficient. We have a few exceptions called sweet peat, but most of what you're going to be buying is going to be acidic and nutrient deficient. Some of these mixes have been amended with fertilizer and or lime, and it might be a slow release fertilizer. It's probably NP and K. Some of these have not. So you want to, if you're purchasing the product, you want to take a look at the ingredient list on the bag. So when you're growing in a container with a peat-based mix, you have to take particular attention to be sure that you're getting a complete availability of macro and micro nutrients. One of the big physiological disorders, if we can use that term, that we see on container grown tomatoes and zucchini and other vegetables like this is blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency. And that's because you're growing them in a peat-based mix, which really doesn't have a lot of available calcium. So we want to be very conscious, if we're using a water-soluble fertilizer, that we select water-soluble fertilizers that contain NP and K, as well as some calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and then a package of the trace nutrients. Okay, Troy and I thought we should summarize this a little bit, and we'll have an opportunity to field some of your questions. But soil test, soil test, soil test. I thought maybe 1 soil test was okay, but Troy insisted on 3. I'll tell you one real quick story. In our business, we typically want to start everyone off with a soil test. So if you haven't done this yet, get a good quality certified soil test. There was a gentleman that came in the office and he said, you know, I got a little problem. I've got eggs and I keep planting them and I never get chicks. And he says, I plant them vertically, I plant them horizontally, I plant them 3 inches deep, I plant them 6 inches deep, and I still never give chicks. So the extension educator said, well, you know, I think I have a way to solve your problem, but I have to start with a soil test. So a little bit of humor there. We're often criticized because we do always like to start with a soil test. It really gives us a pretty good idea of exactly where we are to start. Doesn't necessarily have to be done every year once you get P and K levels up, but you certainly want to get a high quality soil test from University of Minnesota lab or one of the other certified soil testing laboratories. So correct your phosphorus and your potassium deficiencies. They can be quite stable once they're corrected. And then you adjust your pH if it's indicated. And then, as we've said before, you really want to supply nitrogen as needed annually and in many cases throughout the growing season. So those are my comments, and we're going to take your questions. Is that correct, Katie?
Yeah, so if you want to go ahead and stop sharing, Bob, we do have a couple of questions here that we've been saving a little bit for you.
Okay.
I heard that worm castings from vermicomposting are pH neutral and stimulate plant growth due to micronutrients. Can you comment?
Oh, it's a good, that is a good question.
Bob?
Yes.
In relationship to this, I've had a fair bit of experience with this, specifically with my worm grower. So if you wouldn't mind me commenting, I'd be happy to share.
I'd appreciate that.
So you're correct, Katie, in saying that they will help to begin to neutralize. They also are much more efficient at if you do add things like lime to your mix as the worms go through that process, they will help bring that to the stabilized pH much, much quicker. Ultimately, though, if there's not magnesium and calcium in that bed as they work it over, it will still remain fairly acidic generally, based on the fact that most of these beds are peat-based. But in other cases, if they're just using typical composting worms, it will revolve quite extensively around what they're feeding their critters. In addition to that, there was a question about some of the micronutrients in the worm juice, and the worms are just making those nutrients more available for the plants to take up, and so that's really the benefit of that process.
Awesome, thanks, Troy.
That's great, Troy. If I could quickly comment, Katie,
Yep.
we do get this question on pH and compost quite often. And when you go through the composting process, we will develop acid conditions. And as the compost pile typically matures, we come back closer to neutrality. So I think that we have a phenomenon called sour mulch sometimes, where certain compost materials, if the feedstock is very woody in nature, poplar in particular, or aspen, we can get an acid condition that people should be aware of. And you really want to be certain that that compost has matured. This is why we always recommend that rather than direct applying organic materials to your fields, that you compost first. So we go through that change in pH, that alternate pH, and by the time the product is matured, it's going to be neutral in nature, and you get all the benefits and none of the potential problems with a highly acidic, immature compost.
More compost questions here, and then we'll move on to a couple others. If you're looking to tailor your compost closer to your soil needs, are there certain things that you should add more or less of, or is it all the same?
Well, that's great. That goes back to the one slide that I had there, where we took a look at the carbon nitrogen ratios. And I think that's really a very good question. You're going to get balance with a lot of the manures, but if you start with what we call feedstocks, is what's going in the compost pile. If you start with materials that are going to be naturally high in nitrogen, and anything that's green, obviously, is going to be higher in nitrogen. Certainly, manures are going to be higher in nitrogen. And in the case of food scraps, particularly if there's any kind of a protein component, and people, of course, are advised not to apply a lot of those meat products into a compost pile. If you're going to use them, you want to make sure that you've got a lot of bulking, what we call bulking agent, which is either peat or it's leaves or it's wood chips, so that you don't attract any kind of vermin to the meat product as it's beginning to decompose. So you need to be very conscious of that, but that is a way of getting a little higher nitrogen available. So yes, you can tailor it depending on the type of material you're composting.
Can you clarify how you know that your compost has matured? Troy, I think one of you two were talking about mature compost.
Want to try that? Take that, Troy?
Go ahead, Bob.
You know, I think that first, the compost pile, when it's actively being managed and the composting process is going on, you're generating a lot of warm temperatures, 130, 140 degrees in a well-managed pile. So one of your key indicators is certainly that temperature has dropped for you. Now, in many cases, depending on how you constructed the pile, that may mean that you're just deficient in oxygen and moisture. You may turn it in the process, may start again. So if you turn the pile, you're sure that you've got enough moisture. You've got enough oxygen there because you've got a porous pile. Oftentimes you'll reheat once or twice, and then when you never reheat or don't reheat, that's often a good indication that the compost pile is mature. It will have a very earthy smell to it, which is also kind of an indication for you as well. You can get compost piles hot. You can get them black in a short period of time, a month, 3 or 4 weeks. But really, compost takes, for most of us, a good year to mature, even in a pile that's properly managed.
And then we did have one question about my compost manual for materials states that I should not add cooked foods, only raw fruits or vegetables. Do you have a comment on that? Is that accurate?
Well, my thought is just that cooked materials, you're going to lose some of the nutrient composition.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see a problem with using cooked materials. Can you, Troy?
Not at all, Bob. It is going to impact the nutrient concentrations, but above and beyond that, that decomposition process will actually occur much quicker in cooked foods as compared to raw foods, just because it'll break down faster due to the heat treatment that had already occurred.
All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit here. What is a good soil mix for container gardening? And then is Miracle-Gro a good soil mix?
Well, we stay away from all the name brands, don't we, Troy? Or trademarks, for lots of different reasons. But that is the big kid on the block, obviously. I think they all can be good. I go back again. If it's a packaged mix, take a look at the bag. Take a look at the ingredients list. There are different components being added. Is there fertility, and what type of fertility that is there? And in many cases, if you've got straight mix and they miss the trace nutrients or a couple of the macronutrients other than NPK, I'm talking calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, you may be advised to put together a little bit of your own mix with a sandy loam component that you've pasteurized, so we don't have some of the insect and disease issues, but cut in some mineral soil, a good light mineral soil, and that basically will take care of a lot of the issues with some of the macros as well as some of the trace nutrients. Any comments, Troy?
I do believe that Robin did a great job yesterday talking about the aspects of some of these mixes. We want to make them fairly light and fluffy, but that mineral component is really the aspect that helps provide that micronutrient component. And so having a small amount of mineral soil in there, not too much, so that the seeds don't have good soil to seed contact, or perhaps stay too wet as they are germinating, but enough there to give them a good start with those micronutrients as they are taking off.
All right. Why is humus added to commercial bags of manure? Excuse me. So why is humus added to commercial bags of manure?
I think it's humus, probably. Is what
Humus, yeah.
No, I think it might be texture that they're looking for. You know, there should be plenty of microbial activity both in the manure as well as humus. Sometimes it's economics, sometimes it's texture and porosity. Sometimes products are added just to give them a little bit of an edge that makes them a little bit different, a little bit more unique. But I think that there should be plenty of microbial activity, both in the manures and perhaps some in the humus as well.
If my soil test came back and it recommends a certain fertilizer mix for my garden, can I just add the fertilizer to the area where the plants are rather than covering my entire garden with fertilizer?
Right.
So in relationship to that, Katie, my recommendation would be that is an option, but realizing that you may create hot spots over time if you don't do a broadcast. That would be called side dressing by putting the nutrients just on the plant. Generally speaking, for most home gardeners, it's better to do a broadcast application. And then if you need a good source of maybe nitrogen or potassium in the case of your potato area, or nitrogen in relationship to your corn, then the side dressing can be very, very suitable. One thing that I always caution people when they are doing a side dressing,
Oh, we're losing you a little bit there,
especially
Troy.
if you're dealing, especially if we are dealing with nutrients, inorganic nutrients, the concentrations are quite high. And so because of that, you can over apply very, very readily. So do your calculations before you get that process started.
If I could just add to that, that's so correct, Troy. If you take a look at, if you're side dressing, generally you're coming over the top around the plant, that's got to be a soluble nutrient. That's generally going to be nitrogen. And we look at our most common nitrogen source, that's 46% nitrogen. So I see many, many people over applying nitrogen to the point where you're going to get a burn. And you have to be very careful with side dressing if you're using a synthetic commercial nitrogen source because of the concentration.
All right. This gets into a little bit, I don't remember which one of you are talking about this, but if you're adding wood ash for potash, does it make a difference what kind of trees that they come from?
You know, I actually did some research on that, and there are slight differences, which is interesting, into what we call the calcium carbonate equivalent, or the liming capacity of different ashes, but it's not really significant. And Kai, you can certainly comment on that, because we've done quite a bit with land application of some of these products. And I think for homeowners, you never want to apply a wood ash unless you've had a soil test and it calls for a liming recommendation. And then you can substitute, in some cases, ashes actually have a higher calcium carbonate equivalent, so you don't want to exceed the amount of wood ash per pound as is recommended or advised on the soil test. You might even want to back off. So if it's, you know, 50 pounds and 100 square feet, you might want to back off to 35 or 40 pounds of a wood ash if that's what you're going to be using as a liming source. You do pick up the nutrient, but that should be your secondary consideration, because if you over apply a wood ash thinking that you're supplying potassium, phosphorus, then you may have a pH that's too high, and it can be more of a challenge bringing it back down again. Always easier to go up than it is to work your way back down again. Any comments, Troy?
I agree completely with you, Bob, and it doesn't surprise me that you did research on wood ash. But anyhow, in relationship to that, a couple of other components to think about. The more complete the burn is, the higher the concentration of the nutrients. That is not only in relationship to its ability to change pH, but also the nutrient composition that is in there. The other thing that I've seen is that when you change the soils that the trees are growing on, that will actually have more of an impact on what the nutrient concentration of that ash is as compared to the type of tree that is actually generating the wood ash.
That's fascinating.
We have a couple people asking, how can I add ground up eggshells to my soil around the plants, broadcast, composting?
Well, it's a good source of calcium, and eggshells should be added to the compost pile. Again, it boils down to availability, and you know, you're not going to be highly soluble, so working that into the process either through the compost pile and starting the breakdown process, or direct incorporation if you've got a limited amount. But once again, if you've got a calcium deficiency that's being expressed in the plant, in other words, you've got blossom end rot that's very apparent to you, you need a soluble form of calcium. And in some cases, we've got you know, ag lime as a source, calcium carbonate, and some of that can be very readily available depending on the type and the form. And there are also there are other available commercial soluble forms of calcium. So the eggshells are just fine, but they're not, once again, that release is going to be very slow. If you got a problem, you want to look for a more soluble form of calcium to address the issue.
So a couple.
Pell
Go ahead.
lime would be the most available long-term sort of quickly available product, or a calcium nitrate, one or the other.
That's why with a mix, you know, a potting soil mix for a container, it's really nice to see the addition of lime, because that does pick up the calcium component for you, as well as adjusting the pH. You got to be a little careful if you're adding lime to take care of a calcium deficiency, then be aware you're also pushing your pH up. So you have to be a little careful there.
So a few questions around wood chips. So can I add raw wood chips as mulch to my flower garden? And then if I'm adding mulch, is that changing my soil nutrients?
Another good question. If we go back to the one slide, I showed you the CN ratio, carbon to nitrogen on a wood product is very high, which means it's going to be slow to break down. So a mulch goes on the soil surface as opposed to feedstock for compost. You don't want it to break down. So I think it's a great source. It will pull nitrogen from the soil because it's very high in carbon. So you have to compensate with a little additional nitrogen. You just want to be a little careful because it will also hold moisture. So you want to be careful. You want it away from the actual plant stems so that we don't have the possibility of disease there. Any other thoughts, Troy? And the type of wood mulch, they're going to break down. The pine's softwood material breaks down faster than hardwood does. But being aware of nitrogen deficiencies, they make pretty good, really good mulches as opposed to feedstock for the compost pile.
We also have a question. Garden center near me recommended using compost as mulch. Does that seem like a good idea?
Comments? I think it's fine. It's, you know, it has its place there, certainly. I think it may be kind of an expensive composting material. That's just my perspective on it, but it certainly could be used. It's going to break down faster for you. So you might have to reapply faster than a wood chip or a pine needle mulch might, but it should be just fine.
Adam, it looks like you were looking at answering this question about can herbicide-treated grass clippings be added to compost after a certain time after the treatment? Do you want to answer that one, Adam?
I actually kind of hit that on accident, but I will try to answer that anyways. Different herbicides have different residuals and carryovers, so it kind of needs to be tackled on an individual basis. As far as what the effects that composting has on herbicide carryover, I guess Bob and Troy, maybe you have a better insight on that. But really the answer is it depends on the herbicide and how long that residual effect lasts.
Generally, we don't recommend using grass that's been treated with any type of herbicide as a mulch or in your compost, but certainly.
You know, Katie, for some people that may be avoidable, Adam is so right about it does depend on the component. And at one time we had some herbicides that were being routinely used on lawns, and there were residuals, and there was some issues with them. Most of your common materials now in the composting process are going to break down quite readily, actually.
All right, so here's a product I'm not familiar with, Hugelkultur.
Hugelkultur, yeah.
Good way to fill the bottom of a raised bed, or does it tie up or use nutrients I need for my veggies?
Well, that's using a wood product. And once again, there's that slow deterioration. It's definitely going to pick up nitrogen, but it's a slow process. And part of that is just the way these are constructed, a lot of berms and so forth, built up with materials that aren't going to break down real quickly. But anytime you're breaking down a wood product like that, you have to be aware of the potential for nitrogen deficiency.
Along that same line is, depending on the amount of cover that they put on top of that, as far as soil goes, you may actually get it to a point where it's anaerobic, and that will also slow that decomposition process. And then the roots will go in there and be somewhat of a way in which to help aerate that as well. So that is another component to think about in regards to that process.
Should I add anything to my compost, water, fertilizer, some type of agent?
Well, we know what not to add. You really don't have to add any of the prepared starter solutions. There's plenty of microbial activity that's naturally going to be there. You really, the components, really, you want a good porous pile. You want about minimum of 50% oxygen in there. So I would say construct your pile with a bulking agent so that you naturally get air that moves through there and picks in the oxygen. You need about 20% moisture. So pick up, oftentimes dry leaves in the fall are too dry. Have the garden hose ready so you get some moisture there. And you can just dig into that pile. You should just be able to squeeze out a little bit of moisture on the interior of the pile. That gives you an idea of the amount of moisture. So you need your feedstock for energy and protein. You need you need adequate oxygen. So build a nice porous pile, and then you need you do need to have nitrogen. You need to have oxygen, water, and then your proper feedstocks. In many cases, if you don't have sufficient nitrogen, you're going to have to think a little bit about adding green material, which has a chlorophyll component, or you're going to have to add some kind of a high nitrogen compost, or you're going to have to add some kind of a synthetic fertilizer that's higher in nitrogen.
So this question here, I'll answer from a food safety standpoint, but then if there's things that you guys have to add, are there any problems with throwing vegetable scraps straight into the garden if those vegetable scraps like came from a plate or someone has eaten on there? You would have the concern of if they are sick or they, you know, any E. coli, things like that could be added into the garden. But if it's, you know, carrot peelings or things like that, there's less of that issue, but I would recommend composting first. I guess, do you guys have anything else to add to that?
Along those lines, Katie, Bob and I were visiting earlier today, and this falls a lot in line with raw manures. If we're going to go ahead and do this, our recommendation would be to actually allow them to grow a cover crop in that area for a full season, so that the bacteria that naturally occurs in the soil has a chance to kill the bad bacteria that might be coming from those table scraps. And really, that's the best management practice that we would recommend in relationship to overcoming issues with E. coli, for example, with fresh livestock manures from that standpoint.
You know, Katie, I would agree with you that we like to compost first. Small amounts, a few carrot peelings, doesn't really make any difference. But once again, if you're taking those kitchen waste scraps and you're incorporating, there isn't much oxygen down there in the soil. So your composting process is slowed down quite a bit. Compost first, get that process out of the way, and then move it onto the garden.
That was a perfect segue into the next question here. Is my covered composter needing oxygen? Should I leave my cover off at times?
Not oxygen at all. Possibly it could be moisture. You know, you're obviously, when you've got an open and exposed pile, you're getting some rainfall. So you want to be conscious of that. And, you know, I think the biggest thing on composting, because we'd like to compost right through the winter months, is these smaller rotating drums freeze solid pretty readily. If you build a big pile and 4 feet by 4 feet at a minimum, maybe 5 feet, that outer layer insulates the composting process. So you can compost right through the winter months, move it into the fall. If you manage it properly, it can almost be completed by the spring. But in smaller containers, they tend to freeze quite readily. So the larger the container, the larger the pile, the additional benefit you're going to get from self-insulating and being able to compost in the freezing months.
Colored wood chips, are those bad for gardens when they eventually decompose, specifically vegetable garden?
You know, I think in most cases, we've been conscious of some of this. I really don't think there's an issue. We obviously had the issue with some of the copper compounds and some of the wood preservatives being used. But a lot of those issues have been addressed at this particular point. So I don't think there's an issue there at all. And obviously the color bleeds away pretty fast anyway as the composting and decomposition process occurs.
All right, well, we are about out of time. Thank you, Troy, Bob, and Adam for presenting today. I think everyone really enjoyed it. You will, again, attendees, be receiving a survey, and we will get that link sent to you for tomorrow's as well. I know there were some tech issues today. Hopefully those will be addressed before we get into tomorrow. So thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate you being here and hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thanks and have a great day. Also, they enjoy the flag outside of your car window, Troy.
I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks, Claire.